Well, I think we have a quorum, so let's go ahead and get started. Appreciate having all of you here. We are coming this morning, as you know, to the beginnings of our next segment of the history of the church. We've spent 13 weeks looking, as you know, at the first 500 years, which is actually a disproportionate amount of time, but it's so important in the history of the church that I felt justified in devoting that kind of attention to it. But that means we need to do a little bit of scampering now to catch up and be back more or less on schedule. This was all pre-planned. I know my wife really doubts that, but some of the rest of you I may fool on that point. But nevertheless, we are going to now cover the next 500 years rather rapidly. I'll be actually just spending 2 weeks on it this week, and then 3 weeks from today. You know, we have 2 weeks off. Father Shakur is here next week, and you want to be sure to participate here in the sanctuary in that presentation. And the following week will be the annual meeting, and so I have 2 weeks off, and the following week we'll be back here on the 11th of February and pick up in the last part of this section that we're looking at now, that we're calling medieval Christianity. That's the period of time from 500 to roughly 1000. Then we'll slow down a little bit, so we'll be about halfway through, both time-wise and lecture-wise, and more or less march through the rest of the history of the church at a fairly even pace from that point on. Obviously, we'll take a little extra time on the Reformation and the whole complex of events that surrounds that. I think you'll find very interesting as well. But in any event, this morning we're coming then to what we're calling medieval. This is my very original title for this period of time, medieval Christianity. So we're coming to this moment at this juncture. So let's have a word of prayer then and we'll get underway. Heavenly Father, we again are very grateful to you for the rich and wonderful privilege that it is to gather in this place with your people to review the way in which you have worked through your church through human history. We thank you that this story is your story and that you are unfolding in it the great truths of redemption, that we can gain great courage through the folks that you have raised to positions of prominence and used mightily, as we recognize that they are just individual men and women like us, and yet you have lifted them and raised them up to extraordinary positions of service and influence. And so we pray that our review of the matters before us this morning would lead us through this review to see Christ more clearly, devote our lives to him more fully. We give you thanks for it in the name of Jesus. Amen. As you're probably aware, when we come to this moment of transition, it is a huge shift in the whole outlook of the West, really, at this time. The way in which people thought about life and thought about the place of the church and so on. There's an overused phrase I can't resist using at this point, paradigm shift. You know, that's really what's going on here as we move from the ancient period then to the medieval period. Historians have debated as to what's the appropriate time to pin as the moment when you make the shift. That in itself is a little bit artificial. You know, it's not like people woke up one day and thought, look, Mabel, it's the Middle Ages. You know, it doesn't happen that way. There's kind of a gradual sort of change that takes place over generations. But historians have argued for various dates as early as 313, when Christianity was legitimized. I've seen some argument in favor that that's when medieval Christianity began. Others have argued that it should be 325, the first ecumenical council of the church, Nicaea, that we looked at here. Others have argued 378. That's when the Roman Empire was first subjected to the first major invasion from the barbarians. The Visigoths invaded and did quite a bit of destructive work at that point, and some have argued that really marked the shift to the medieval period. Many have argued, and I'm pretty much in this school of thought, that 476, which is the death of the last Roman emperor, is the point when we should really demarcate the change from the ancient to the medieval period. This is really when Rome, as it were, collapses. Now, it's not an overnight event, as you can well imagine, but really the far-flung expanse of the Roman world caved in at that point. The Roman troops, such as they were, came home, if you will. Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall. And as much as there has been attempts by all the king's horses and all the king's men to reassemble Humpty, it hasn't happened. And so that really has been typically the date that is marked as the moment. Others, however, have looked into an even later time, to the year 590, which is the moment of the accession of the first, what's usually called medieval pope, Pope Gregory the First, sometimes called Gregory the Great, and his influence is extremely important, and many would say that really does mark the point where medieval Christianity gets underway and the ancient period closes. You'll notice that I'm choosing 500. Nothing happened in 500. That's just an arbitrary date, but I'm picking it because it is halfway, or at least modestly, between, on the one hand, 476 and 590, and it's a round number, and so I thought that worked well. So that's what we're choosing as our date for the shift that took place to the medieval period. But I'm really thinking more in terms of the end of the Roman world with the death of the last Roman emperor. The term Middle Ages was actually coined by a guy named Christopher Keller, who lived in the 1600s in England. He was an English historian, and he divided history into major periods of time. And he recognized ancient history as being that history that unfolded up to 325, the Council of Nicaea. And then he identified what he called modern history as that which commenced in 1453 with the Renaissance, which is where he demarcated it. He was very impressed with what happened in ancient history. He was very impressed with what was happening in modern history. He said in the middle was the middle, and not much happened there. And so he called that the Middle Ages. And since then, we have had this habit of referring to this period of time as the Middle Ages. And so that's where that term has come from. Many times you will hear the first few hundred years, specifically the first 500 years of that period, called the Dark Ages. That is a term that was invented by the Renaissance thinkers. Of course, there is this thing called temporal provincialism, which means everybody believes that when they are living in history is when all of the greatest thoughts and the greatest happenings are happening. We tend to be that way ourselves. We're abysmally ignorant as a culture of history, and we tend to think that the only important things that are happening are what's going on in today's newspaper. You know, it's temporal provincialism. Well, the Renaissance folks had a little bit of that malady themselves, and so they thought with all of the wonderful advances that were coming by virtue of the Renaissance and the rediscovery of the classics and so on, that what had just gone before was really a time of very little advance, very little accomplishment, and so they just put it under the pejorative title, the Dark Ages. I am not going to use that term. In fact, I want to expressly repudiate that phrase here. That is not, I believe, a fair assessment of what happened. And actually, this period of time that we call medieval Christianity was really in many ways a very important time, and in some ways at least a time of progress and a time of accomplishment. If we could choose between living in the medieval period of time and, let's say, ancient Rome, as Christians, I don't think it would take us a nanosecond to figure out we'd rather be in the medieval period. Now, maybe if we could have our preferences, we'd rather live today, but those folks didn't have that option. And so far, that was the best thing going, was what they had available to them at that time. So anyway, this sort of pejorative judgment, the Dark Ages, I think has probably been a little overblown and somewhat unfair. If we were Catholics, if we were Roman Catholics, we would have quite a different perspective on this period anyhow. The medieval period is sometimes regarded, I've rarely heard it called this by Catholic historians, but if I can use the term rather loosely, kind of a golden age, really, in the history of the church. They would view this as a time of high accomplishment, high achievement in the church, a time that is really to be celebrated rather than this more negative assessment that came through the Renaissance. They Catholic historians would tend to see the period preceding the medieval time as classical paganism, pre-Christian, and they would look at history that comes afterwards as being really the victim of the negative influences of Protestantism, the fragmentation, the disintegration that occurred as a result of that. And so really this is the time when you find kind of a high synthesis. And so for the Roman Catholics that has been a distinctively important feature, because there's been part of the vision of the Roman Catholic understanding is that everything should ultimately be within, as it were, the church. This is a certain way of viewing Augustine's city of God, and in many ways the medieval period of time actually accomplished something of that. All right. Demographically, this medieval period is quite different from ancient Christianity, at least partly because the geography of it is much more expansive. The population that we find within the medieval church is much different, much more varied. Classical Christianity tended to be localized in Rome, and kind of the Roman centers were the place where the Christian presence was concentrated. Now it's much more diverse. You have many different ethnic groups that come in. There's not only the Latin population that would be part of Southern Europe and so on, but you also have the Celtic population up in the British Isles, the Welsh, the Irish, the Britons, and so on. You have the Germanic tribes, the Teutonic tribes would all represent another big slice of the population pie. The Slavonic groups, the Russian, Bulgarian, Moravian, and so on would all fall within that. And the church, in a sense, is touching all of these. And so in some ways the church now expands dramatically in terms of both Eastern and Western growth. And that, by the very nature of the case, presents some interesting new challenges and so on in the life and health and ministry of the church. The leading powers, this is all kind of a preliminary comments about this whole medieval period. The leading powers, if you will, the great influences of medieval Christianity and medieval civilization would first of all be the Pope. We talked a few weeks ago about the rising power of the Pope in earlier times. Really with Gregory the First, the papacy reaches its, the kind of form that we typically think of when we think of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, and becomes a very significant power in ways that we'll look at in a minute. Monasticism becomes very important. Monasteries were a far-flung institution. You have them all over the place, and they in many ways performed a great service during this time. Keep in mind, of course, that with the collapse of Rome, the collapse of central government goes with it, and you fall into a highly decentralized and in some ways rather savage and barbarian jungle, at least in its early beginnings. This was not a happy time to live, really, with the collapse of the orderliness that had come by virtue of the Roman world. And what was there to fill the gap? It was the church. And even though the feudal period had a lot of bloodshed, a lot of violence, nevertheless the presence of the church, while it certainly wasn't perfect, nevertheless tended to be the ordering principle by which a certain amount of the stability of life was maintained in the absence of the imperial authority that had passed off the scene at an earlier time. So you've got the Pope, you've got the monastic movement, which became, in a sense, the presence of the church here and there around the world, and finally the scholastics. The scholastic movement was the scholarly movement of the time, which really was chiefly responsible for preserving learning, not really adding to it much. There's not great innovative thinking that's going on here. These 500 years, we don't have an Augustine, we don't have an Anselm, we don't have an Aquinas, we don't have some great genius that really gives us, you might say, the intellectual new advance. But nevertheless, you do have a whole bunch of people who were committed to at least preserving and consolidating what had already been accomplished. And so medieval scholasticism performed this service of protecting, as it were, the accomplishments of the past. Very meticulous copyists who would copy the writings of other scholars and study them meticulously. Now, the scholastics have gotten a bad name because in some ways it seems that their work was somewhat irrelevant. We think of caricatures of them like, scholastic thinkers and students sitting around debating, questions like how many angels dance on the head of a pin. That's where that came from, this idea of, looking at these mundane, pedantic, detailed, irrelevant concerns. I mean, who cares? And of course the answer to that is, the answer to that question. 0 if they're Baptists, because Baptists don't dance. Oh, it's terrible. Well, anyway, that's as good as the humor gets in here, so you just have to live with it. But in any event, those were the kinds of debates some people would say. Now, they were really taking on bigger debates than that. They were taking on, questions that really did have some importance theologically. But you would say that the work of the scholastics was not that sort of thing that just flowed to the great benefit of the people of God generally, such as would have been the case with an Augustine or others that had gone before, or those who would come after. But nevertheless, that was another great movement and important force during that period of time. How can you just characterize this? The medieval period represents, as it were, the third experiment in how the church relates to the world. The first experiment was in that early period, 100 to 325, and the experimental paradigm was this. The state tries to destroy the church. That's experiment number 1. And some people would say that's good for the church. Tertullian said the blood of the martyr is the seed of the church. And so martyrdom actually added to the church's life. And some people would say that's the way it should be. The church should be persecuted. Most Christians would hope for another alternative there. Then you've got another period of time where, in a sense, rather than persecuting the church, the state mothers the church, provides for her, oversees her, and indeed to some degree controls her. That would be the experiment after Constantine and up to the end of that ancient period around 500. That had some problems too, because then we begin to see the kind of paper-thin faith that I was talking about last week. Now the third experiment, the third design, is where the, as it were, church mothers the world. This is the point where the church now, in a sense, rises up to the head of the line and more or less controls everything, so that all of your life is to some degree more under the influence of the powers of the church than any other single cultural influence. And so what's going on here is really a clear-cut attempt to create what you might call Christian civilization, but in a sense doing it not by the gentle persuasion that comes through the church, but more or less by a kind of autocratic virtual tyranny that comes through the church, more or less imposing it upon the population. Let's see how that works, And so the medieval period in some ways was really characterized by that. One of the interesting features that comes by virtue of that is that even though the Christian church had been born in a fairly civilized setting, Rome, in spite of some of the more negative things we may say about it, was a civilization that was quite sophisticated in many ways. Their legal system, their whole theory of government and so on, their writers, their philosophers, their historians, very well educated, very classically oriented. So the church, in a sense, had to carry on the debate in the public square at a relatively sophisticated level. When the philosophers of the church, Justin Martyr, or Tertullian, or Cyprian, or Origen, or others, came, they came as educated people who wanted a hearing in the public square. They wanted to win the debate in the marketplace of ideas, and so they did writing in a way that was sophisticated and credible and impressive on its own terms, and that was part of the way the Christian faith carried on that debate. By the time we get to the medieval period, there's no longer that level of sophistication. These are now people who are largely uneducated, uncivilized, and they have a tendency, therefore, towards superstition. And in many ways, the church could simply name the game, simply say, this is the way it is, and there would be a belief in that just by virtue of the church having stated it. It was taking Augustine's principle that was called fides implicitum to an extreme. Fides implicitum means implicit faith. And in some ways now this period is a time of implicit faith in the church. But that breeds a kind of hazard when people simply stop thinking and simply trust what's being stated by the church without any sort of critical examination of it. This was what got Martin Luther in trouble some many years later when he said, unless I am convinced by sacred scripture or evident reason, I will not recant. And the powers of the church said, what do you mean unless you are convinced? What kind of nonsense is it? We don't have to convince you of anything. We're saying it. You believe it. That settles it. Isn't that the end of the discussion? Luther says, no. My conscience has to be persuaded. I cannot simply accept without critical examination what you're telling me, And that was really the beginning of the Reformation, was a departure from what had become almost standard fare during the medieval period. So we see that kind of influence coming in as well. There has never been a time in the history of the world when the church has exercised a greater power over the human mind. So during this period, the church monopolizes all of learning, all of science, all of art. She rules your life from the cradle to the grave, you see. Philip Schaff, the church historian, says, quote, she founded universities, built lofty cathedrals, stirred up crusades, made and unmade kings, dispensed blessings and curses to whole nations. The church running the world. So there you are. And that really, in some ways, I'm maybe overstating that slightly, but that's the flavor of this period. All right, let's take a look for a moment at Gregory the First. He is the one who probably more than any other single figure is identified as the transitional bridge from ancient to medieval Christianity, this first great pope, at least pope in the medieval sense of that term now that comes along. So Gregory the Great, I'd just like to give you a little sketch of his life. I think that'll be helpful. Gregory was born in 540, so he's born about 60 to 70 years after the last Roman emperor has died. He's born into a time of some upheaval. Rome itself now has greatly contracted. The city of Rome has become kind of a city-state, and its immediate environs are under Roman rule, but certainly the expansive Roman Empire is simply a distant memory when Gregory is born. He was born in Rome. He was born of a very wealthy family. He studied law, which in fact many of those who have gone into influential positions in the history of the church, surprisingly enough, started by studying law, of all things. That usually comes as a shock to folks, but nevertheless, he studied law, was trained in that area. In 573, when he was 33 years old, he was made a prefect in Rome. That would be a fairly prestigious position for a young man, be kind of like being elected to the city council or something of this major city and so on. But it was about that time, just when it seemed that his career was really getting going, that he came in contact with the Benedictine order of monks. Now, I mentioned last week the Benedictines, and Benedict himself we mentioned in passing briefly, and the Benedictine rule, which was very ascetic, very self-deprived, self-restrictive, and this young man, Gregory, was so impressed with the Benedictine monks with whom he'd come in contact that it actually moved him to abandon his career and indeed disavow his family ties, sell off his wealth, and adopt a impoverished and ascetic life, and he took the oath of the Benedictine order and became a Benedictine monk at 33 years old, abandoning his otherwise rather happy prospects for a life in politics and so on. He became a passionately committed Benedictine, and over the next 30 years or so was responsible for founding and establishing 7 major monasteries here and there around Europe. Each of them very well populated by those who had joined the Benedictine order. and otherwise very successful. So he really distinguished himself as a great leader then in this particular time with the rising monastic movement. What happened in 590 was that the present reigning Bishop of Rome, a man by the name of Pelagius, not to be confused with the Pelagius who debated with Augustine some years earlier, but Pope Pelagius died, and by a kind of obvious acclamation, Gregory was the person to take the position. And so Gregory, who had been a Benedictine monk and an abbot of these monasteries and so on, is catapulted into this prominent position of being the Bishop of Rome. And that, of course, was where he made his greatest contribution and did his most important work. Probably the thing that he's most remembered for is that he was able to expand the power of the Bishop of Rome many times over what it had been up to that point. It had been very powerful, but it was Gregory who really extended the power of the Roman bishopric beyond anything that had ever taken place before. He did this in an interesting way. He was a very humble man. In fact, he never permitted himself to be called the Pope. You know, the word Pope from Papa actually means father, and it had been common to start using that term up until that time, but Gregory would have none of it. He didn't want to be called the Pope. He didn't want to have that kind of sense of being some sort of authoritarian leader, at least overtly. He didn't want that to be associated with the character of his rule. Nevertheless, he exercised vast power and authority, really, over the Christian world of that time. In 602, he probably succeeded in achieving what would be called the status of the Bishop of the Universal Church. Up until this time, there had been two great heads of Christendom. There had been the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Bishop of Rome, the Eastern Church, the Western Church, more or less vying in some ways, competing for the first position. Because of certain things that took place politically, Gregory was able, and I'm not going to go into great detail here, but simply advise you, he was the one that finally made the Bishop of Rome, for the first time really in the history of the church, the first position in the church. And he did that by a variety of as I say, political alliances and so on, kind of backroom deals. He was, and I don't mean that in a negative sense necessarily, but he was a very astute politician, as comes out in a great deal of his story. He was very missions-minded. He sent missionary monks all around the world. He particularly loved the British Isles and sent many missionaries there and attempted to win them over. Now, Britain and Ireland were all under the control really of a kind of Celtic Christianity. I mentioned in connection with St. Patrick last week, but by the influence of Gregory's missionaries and others, Britain was finally won over to the Roman Catholic Christian faith and remained that way for centuries to come. It really wasn't until Henry VIII, who we will look at much later, that Britain actually broke from Rome. But this was the time when Britain actually came within the fold, as it were. The great contributions that Gregory made, and the reason this is important is because he's the one that really leaves the imprint on the whole medieval period. It's his thought, his contribution that continues throughout the succeeding centuries. And so it's not that Gregory was a great thinker in his own right, but because he had such an influence, he left this impression throughout the succeeding generations. You've heard of Gregorian chant. This really originates with Gregory. Gregorian chant, if I could sing, I'd try to give you a little sample of it, but you would be sorry if I tried. But you all know what it is. It's that sound of monks singing in unison in a huge cathedral, and they sort of sing in a minor key, and the sound echoes through these vaulted spaces. Gregorian chant in a sense, was calculated to lift your mind to a different place. This is not the music, as it were, of this world. It's the music of another world. It goes hand in hand with Byzantine art and Gothic architecture, all of which, in a sense, are calling you to different places, a different world. Gothic architecture with its spires lifts the eye upward. So you're thinking about a different place. The music is of a different place. The Byzantine art, of course, doesn't look like normal people. The faces are kind of strange and slightly distorted, again suggesting a different place. All of that was part of the style, as it were, that came through Gregory, that this world is not so important. The most important thing is this other world that we should be thinking about. And that really characterized the medieval period. It's no surprise that in the Renaissance, there was a restoration of interest in this world. The music was more upbeat. You know, Mona Lisa looks like a normal person. The architecture is no longer steeples pointing to the sky, but domes. A dome is a half circle that calls the eye to the center of the circle artistically. That's where your eye goes. Whereas a steeple calls your eye artistically up to the heavens, you see. All of these things were an attempt by the Renaissance to correct what had been viewed as a distortion of the medieval period. But during the medieval period, you do have that. You have a sense in which there's a lot of interest here, and really the mind is carried away to some other place. And that brings with it all kinds of ideas about, you know, the intervention of angels and demons, and what we would regard maybe as a somewhat superstitious kind of view of things, with all of life being filled with these otherworldly players. And really what's going on here in the natural order is of lesser importance. All of that really would be characteristic of part of the imprint that comes through Gregory. I'd like to just touch briefly some of the most important theological notions that came through Gregory's thought, because these really do, again, set the stage for a great deal of what happens in the medieval period, and also a great deal of what was reacted to later in the Renaissance and, more importantly, in the Reformation. So just a couple of thoughts here, just by way of a kind of rapid survey of some of these points. Gregory's approach to human sinfulness was that man is corrupted, he is sinful, and that's both by birth and by choice, but especially by birth. This is kind of a critical point. He said we are born with sin, but we are not born with guilt. We are born with sin, but we're not born with guilt. Now, that may seem like an innocuous point, but really a whole lot rides on that. Because the idea was that there is this became later in the theology of Rome, the doctrine is called the doctrine of concupiscence. And the doctrine of concupiscence in Roman Catholic thought is that there is this within us, which they would say is of sin, derives to sin, inclines towards sin, but it's not sin. You see. Kind of a taint. And the whole Roman Catholic view of baptism is that in baptism, original sin is removed, but concupiscence remains. They would look to Romans chapter 7 and other places to develop that idea. Well, Gregory is really the one who kind of sets the stage for that, with this idea that people can be born with sin but not guilt. The Reformers, by the way, would say that anything that derives from sin, is of sin, inclines towards sin, is sin, you see. That's the approach they would take. But in the Catholic view, there's been this kind of a gray area there that's very, very important in their whole theological outlook, and this comes largely through Gregory and his particular view. This could be called, for the theology buffs in the room, a kind of semi-Pelagianism. We have Augustinianism, which said man is corrupted to the core. End of conversation. There was Pelagianism, which says sin hasn't influenced us much. We're really pretty good. We have hearts of gold, and we can really make it on our own. Grace may facilitate the process, but really you are pretty solid. Just put your nose to the task, you'll do fine. The semi-Pelagians were somewhere in the middle. They didn't want to say we were as bad off as Augustine, but they certainly didn't want to say we were as well off as Pelagius said, and so a compromise position was adopted. Semi-Pelagianism itself was condemned as a heresy and yet became something of the de facto theology of the church in the medieval period. And Gregory was really the one who kind of put that in place with his view of sin. Other little pieces of his theology. He believed in and affirmed the necessity of good works in order to achieve salvation. That is, good works are a partial foundation for your salvation. You have to do good works to be saved. There's been three views on this in church history. There's been the Catholic view, which says good works are a condition precedent to salvation. You need to do them to be saved. There's been a view on the other end of the spectrum that would say good works are irrelevant to your salvation. It doesn't matter. All that matters is faith. If you have faith, whether or not your life changes at all, whether or not there's any, even the tiniest alteration of the way you live, as long as you have faith, then you're okay. You'll be saved. The Reformed Church, of which we are a part here, rejects both of those. Says works form no part of the basis for your salvation, but if you have faith, you will most assuredly have a changed life. Faith without works is dead, is no faith. So if you say you have faith, but there is no change in your life, then your claim to have faith is a false claim. And in fact, you don't have either faith or salvation. So the Reformed churches have been very emphatic of the essential requirement that the life of faith is going to be a life of doing good, a changed life, a pursuit of holiness, not perfection, but certainly a substantial commitment in that direction. But we would say at the same time, those works add precisely nothing to the foundation upon which you were saved. That's all Christ. 100% Christ, 0% my works. But if I am brought to Christ, I will have works by the nature of the case. It's the most complex option of the three. I think it's the biblical one. But Gregory gives us the first of those, that works are actually necessary in order to acquire salvation. Now this became in Catholic doctrine later the doctrine of what's called congruous merit, that there's congruous merit that comes by virtue of works that we may perform. He also affirmed the doctrine of purgatory. Now purgatory had been kicked around by earlier thinkers. Origen, back in the 3rd century, had actually sort of suggested the possibility that there may be a place where Christians who die in the faith, in the church, go to be purged of the guilt from temporal sin. Christ would cleanse you of eternal sin. Purgatory cleanses you from temporal sin, as it said. And so Origen and others had thought about that. It's purely speculative. There's really no biblical warrant for it. It does have some foundation in the Apocrypha, but nothing really in the Old or New Testament that substantiates it. But it had been, at least discussed. But now it's Gregory who really affirms it and says it's a matter of, at least his own teaching, which really left a deep imprint in later thinkers, that is in fact part of the understanding of the Christian faith. Obviously, again, the Reformed theologians who came later reject the idea of purgatory, but this is where it came in more or less officially. Gregory gave essentially an equal place to the tradition of the church as he gave to the Bible, so that the authoritative writing, the Christian, not only the Bible, but also that which the church has declared officially. In other words, he would say the Nicene Creed would be equal to the Bible, the Chalcedonian symbol, other conciliar statements would be included there as part of the authoritative writings. Of course, the Reformers rejected that. Sola scriptura was the position they took. There's a very deep question inside of this, because Gregory was actually establishing the idea, which is again part of Roman Catholic understanding, that the church is in authority over the Bible. Or to put it in the way I've heard Roman Catholic friends of mine say it to me, trying to convince me of this point, the church creates the Bible. And of course, if the church creates the Bible, then the church can create other things that are comparable in authority to the Bible. That would be the idea. This was an extremely important debate in the Reformation, because the Reformers would say not that the church creates the Bible. The term that they used was the term the church receives the Bible. The church receives the Word of God, is in submission to it, not, in a sense, infallibly interpreting it, but submitting to its authority. There's a huge issue there. But at this point, Gregory is essentially affirming then the church in a position over the Bible. And that had a huge impact in later thinking. It was Gregory who really asserted with some degree of vigor that the Mass, that is the celebration of the Lord's Supper, is actually a continuing sacrifice of Christ. Very important in Roman Catholic thought, as you know. That we in the Reformed tradition would say that the celebration of the Lord's Supper is a memorial of the once-for-all death of Christ. We would say that it's a means of grace. In other words, as you participate in the Lord's Supper, God actually gives you strength, actually feeds your inner person, your spirit, building you up in the faith, and so on. Those are all things that happen. But we would certainly shrink from suggesting that Christ is being re-crucified, being re-offered in some sort of renewed sacrifice of his body and his blood, which has been part of Roman Catholic teaching. And it's really through Gregory, again, that we have that idea. You can see how important that is, because it also, in a sense, makes the Catholic Church the only game in town, you see. That if that's where Christ is being offered, then that's the only place you can get salvation. And the whole so-called sacerdotal system, in which the priest within the church becomes the medium by which salvation is, conveyed to the parishioner, makes you highly dependent on that priest, you understand. And so that became part of the culture, you might say, and the belief system of medieval Christianity. Finally, the only other one I'll mention here is that it was Gregory who emphasized pretty heavily the idea of invoking the aid of the saints, so that for life and health and well-being, you can not only pray to God, but you can also address prayers to the saints of the church, asking them to intervene on your behalf and mediate for you various benefits that might come. And you begin to even develop the idea of patron saints of this or that, of travel or of illness or whatever it might be. All of these things certainly have been at least part of the discussion in the church up until this time. There had certainly been those who would repudiate these. In other words, you've got a real mixed bag up until this period. But really, Gregory is the one who sort of puts in place a kind of understanding of the theological matters that more or less ends a lot of the debate, and this becomes more or less standard fare from that point on. So this influence then of Gregory, I don't think can be underestimated. The other discussion we want to have, which we'll save for the next time, is what was happening in the church by the end of this period. But what I'd like to finish up with right now is just a little quick sketch of another individual that was a contemporary of Gregory, and really was the person responsible for giving the church a lot of its grief over the next couple of centuries, a fellow by the name of Muhammad. Muhammad was born in 570. Gregory, as you know, was born in 540. And so you have 30 years later, Muhammad is born, and he's, of course, in the East, lives in and around Constantinople. He was a camel driver, but at some point early in his life married a very wealthy widow. And he was able to retire on the spot, so end of camel driving for him, and he took up religious studies. However, in his experience as a camel driver, he had, of course, come to Constantinople and other communities, in his work, and had come in contact both with Christianity and with Judaism, and his fascination with religion led him then, when he was able to do so in a more leisurely fashion, to study both of those religions. He studied Judaism seriously. He studied Christianity somewhat seriously, but reached the conclusion that both of them were in error, and he began to affirm in that area, which at that time was under deep Christian influence, a rigid monotheism, using the term for God of that language, Allah, and affirming one God, not a trinity, but one God in a very rigid kind of sense. He began preaching that in Medina, which is a city in the, your geography, that would be in the region of Constantinople, but some distance from it. And because he was preaching what appeared to be a new religion, he was actually eventually driven out of Medina, and he fled to the city of Mecca. That took place in 622, so we're still very much within this time frame. He rallied quite a movement in Mecca, and as a result of this large following that he was able to achieve there, actually took over control of the city by a kind of military coup, all of which was revolving around his new religion. So he died in 632, just after Mecca had really been swept into the religious movement that he was advocating. His particular perspective, of course, had a highly militaristic flavor to it. And the whole notion there was that, in a sense, in the name of Allah and in the name of this religious movement, Islam, there should be a conquest of the world. And they took that to heart and began a conquistadorial campaign that originated in Mecca and began to put the pressure on the Christian world in the East, especially during the next several years. The Holy Land, Syria and Palestine, both fell in a really a war of conquest by this Mohammedan movement in the 640s. The Mosque of Omar was erected at that point in Jerusalem. In 652, Persia fell, and over the next 100 years or so, Islam put incredible pressure on the Christian world, threatening both to the east and to the west. And there was a huge amount of bloodshed that was going on during that period of time. And the Christian world was feeling the stress of this big time. Finally, this expansive war and campaign that took place at the hands of the Islamic movement pretty much came to an end by about the year 750. So you've got 100 years or so in which the Mohammedans were really the aggressors in a very conspicuous sort of way against the whole Christian movement, and many Christian people were in fact slaughtered in various wars and so on during that time. This left, of course, in the Christian memory a big, painful, black cloud of anger and hostility against the so-called infidels, which is part of the momentum behind what would become the beginnings of the Crusades about 150 to 200 years later. We're going to look at the Crusades separately, but I wanted to at least give you a little bit of insight as to, the reason the Crusades happened wasn't just that some pope rolled out of bed one morning and thought, let's go, gratuitously assault everybody in the world and try to do some bad things. That wasn't what happened. There had been, an assault already, and so you can understand that there was some desire to shoot back. Now, I'm not saying that's a Christian desire. I'm not trying to justify it, but just explain historically some of the forces that had really given rise to that some period earlier. So really, a contemporary of Gregory is Muhammad, and this whole war of conquest took place over that next 100 and 150 years or so. I think what we'll do is stop at that point, and as I say, we'll have 2 weeks off. We'll come back next time and try to finish up the back end of medieval Christianity, really the beginnings of the Crusades. We'll talk a little bit about that.